What would you do if the person you loved most in this world handed you over to a monster and called it survival? Serena Vale never asked to be collateral. She never asked to be dragged into a world of shadows, gunfire, and men who decide who lives based on nothing more than a number in a ledger. But when her brother vanished and left his debt carved into her skin like a brand, she had no choice. The man waiting for her on the other side of that door had buried people for less. And somehow, against every law of reason, he chose not to bury her. This is the story of what happened inside those walls. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. She didn't cry when they put the hood over her head. That surprised even her. Serena Vale had always assumed that if something like this ever happened, and she'd spent years telling herself it never would, that her brother's problems were his problems, that the wall she'd built between his life and hers was solid enough to hold, she would fall apart. She'd imagined herself screaming, clawing, making enough noise that someone would hear and come running. Instead, she sat still in the back of the SUV, hands zip-tied behind her, breathing slow and measured through the black fabric, and focused on the things she could still control. The road beneath her, the turns, left out of the parking garage, then a long straight stretch, highway, maybe, then right, then another right, then downhill for what felt like 4 minutes before the vehicle stopped. She was counting. She didn't know why. Force of habit, maybe. Or maybe the part of her brain trained to find patterns in chaos was the only part still functioning. The hood came off in a room that smelled like cedar and cold stone. She blinked. High ceilings, a fireplace that hadn't been lit recently, ash in the grate but no warmth left in it. Heavy curtains pulled shut across windows that must have been enormous judging by the frames. 2 men standing by the door with their arms loose at their sides, the particular stillness of people who'd learned to wait. A desk at the far end of the room, dark wood, clear surface except for a single glass of water. Behind the desk, a man. He was looking at something on his phone when she was brought in, and he didn't look up right away. That was its own kind of statement. She'd been delivered like freight, and he was in no particular hurry to inspect the shipment. She used the time to study him instead. Lucien DeMarco was younger than she'd expected. She'd heard the name. Anyone who'd spent time near Nolan's circles had heard it eventually, usually whispered with the kind of careful quiet reserved for things that could hear you. But she'd built a picture in her head of someone older. Someone with the worn, leathery look of a man who'd spent decades making hard decisions. Lucien was maybe mid-30s, lean but not slight. Dark hair cut short enough that it didn't soften the geometry of his face. A jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a long time. Eyes that were a particular shade of gray. Not dramatic, not striking, just the color of overcast sky right before a storm decides what it wants to do. He put the phone down and looked at her. "Serena Vale," he said. Not a question. "That's right. Sit down." "I'd rather stand." Something shifted in the room. One of the men by the door moved forward half a step, hand going to his side. Lucien raised 2 fingers without looking at him, and the man stopped. "Suit yourself," Lucien said. He leaned back in his chair. The leather made no sound. Everything about him was controlled in a way that made her chest tighten. Not with attraction, not then, but with the animal awareness of something dangerous in close proximity. "Your brother stole from me," he said. "I know." "Not money." He paused. "Well, money too. But that's not what I actually want back." Serena kept her face still. "Then what do you want? Right now?" He picked up a pen, set it down again. "I want to understand why a man who knew exactly what would happen to his family if he crossed me decided to do it anyway." "You'd have to ask him." "He's not here." "No," she said. "He's not." The silence stretched. A log shifted in the cold fireplace and sent a small cascade of ash down into the grate. One of the men by the door cleared his throat. Not on purpose, she thought, just a nervous reflex. And Lucien's eyes flicked to him for exactly 1 second. "Your brother left you as collateral," Lucien said. "I assume you know that." "I figured." "Does that make you angry?" She thought about lying. Then she thought about what kind of man sat across from her and decided that the particular kind of lie that told him what he wanted to hear was probably more dangerous than the truth. "Yes," she said. At him or at me? Mostly at him. Lucian studied her. Whatever he was looking for, she couldn't tell if he found it. Most people in your position are on their knees by now, he said, begging, offering things, making promises they can't keep. Would it help? No. Then why would I do it? He almost smiled. Not quite. The corners of his mouth moved in a way that suggested the memory of smiling rather than the act itself. But it was something. You can sit down now, he said. I'm fine. Serena. His voice dropped just slightly. Not threatening, almost patient. Sit down. You've been standing in zip ties for 40 minutes and your hands have gone numb. You're swaying. She hadn't noticed. She sat. One of the men produced a knife. She flinched, couldn't help it, and cut the zip ties. She pulled her arms forward and pressed her wrists together in her lap, feeling the blood move back into her fingers like fire. My brother will come back, she said. I know he will. And when he does, Lucian said, we'll deal with what he actually took. The money is a side issue. The money I can absorb. He set his elbows on the desk. What he took from my operation has a different kind of value, the kind that gets people killed regardless of where they stand. Serena absorbed that. What did he take? You don't know? If I knew, I'd tell you. It wouldn't help me to hide it. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said finally. I don't think it would. He stood. He was taller than she'd clocked from across the room, and he moved the way people did when they'd learned early that the space they occupied mattered. Not aggressive, just certain. You'll stay here until he surfaces. You'll be provided with a room, food, access to limited areas of the house. You won't try to leave. And if I do, you won't. It wasn't a threat. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with the same flat confidence he'd used for everything else. Somehow that was worse than a threat. I need my phone, she said. No. I have a job. You have a situation, he said. Focus on the situation. He walked toward the door. The two men stepped aside for him without being asked. Lucien. She said his name without thinking about it, and he stopped. She didn't know why she'd done it. Maybe because calling him anything else felt wrong, felt like acknowledging a hierarchy she wasn't ready to accept. He turned just enough to look at her over his shoulder. What do you actually think happened? She asked. With my brother. What do you think he was trying to do? The pause before he answered was a fraction too long. I think, he said, that your brother is either the bravest man I've ever encountered or the most foolish, and I haven't decided which one yet. He left without explaining what he meant. She sat alone in the room with the cold fireplace for a long time after that. The room they gave her was on the second floor at the end of a hallway that felt like it had been designed to absorb sound. The carpet was thick, the walls solid, and no noise from the rest of the house reached her once the door was closed. The window looked out over a garden, manicured, large, surrounded by a stone wall she couldn't see the top of from where she stood. And beyond that, trees. She couldn't see the road. A woman named Petra brought her clothes. Late 40s, short gray hair, moving through the room with the efficiency of someone who'd been solving other people's logistical problems for a long time and had made her peace with it. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and when Serena tried to draw her out, asked how long she'd worked here, asked if there were other people in the house, Petra answered in monosyllables that closed every door before Serena could get her foot in. She wasn't cruel. That was the thing. None of them were, at least not overtly. The men who'd taken her hadn't hurt her. Lucien hadn't touched her. The room was clean, the clothes fit. The food that appeared at regular intervals was actual food. But underneath all of that was the understanding, quiet and inescapable, that the kindness had a ceiling, that below it, in the dark, the alternatives waited. Serena didn't sleep the first night. She sat at the window and watched the garden and thought about Nolan. Her brother was 4 years older than her and had been a problem her entire life in the way that certain people are problems. Not out of malice, but out of a fundamental inability to see consequences before they materialized. He was charming, genuinely, the kind of charm that made you want to forgive him even as he was standing in the wreckage of the last thing he'd broken. He'd been like that as a child, When their father was still alive and the family had money, and everything felt like a game that reset every morning. He'd been worse after the bankruptcy, worse still after their father died. She'd covered for him. For years, she'd covered. Paid debts she didn't have, made calls she didn't want to make. Told lies that turned her stomach to people she had to look in the eye afterward. And she'd told herself it was love, which was true in the technical sense that love was involved, but it was also something else, some wired-in obligation she'd never figured out how to cut, even when it kept costing her things she couldn't afford to lose. This time, apparently, it had cost her everything. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and tried to think clearly. Whatever Nolan had taken, this thing that Lucian described as having a different kind of value, it was significant enough that a man who could make entire neighborhoods go quiet chose to hold her here instead of simply using her to send a message. That meant he needed something. It meant there was a calculation happening that she wasn't fully seeing yet. She needed to understand it. She needed information. She needed to get out of this room. By the second day, she'd established a basic geography. The house was large, not obscenely so, but built for permanence, the kind of property that said old money or old power, probably both. The second floor was mostly private. The ground floor had a kitchen, a formal dining room that apparently no one used, a study, and 2 other rooms she couldn't access because the doors were either locked or guarded. The garden was accessible through the kitchen, which felt like an oversight until she reached the wall and confirmed that it was indeed too high, with something along the top edge that she didn't test but suspected. She was in the kitchen on the afternoon of the second day, having talked Petra into letting her make her own coffee. Small act of agency, but she needed it, when she heard the voices outside. Not from the garden, from somewhere around the side of the house, near what she'd mapped as a service entrance. She moved toward the window above the sink. Through the glass, she could see a slice of gravel driveway, and on it, 2 of Lucien's men facing a third figure. Smaller, hunched into a coat that was too large. A kid, couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, and the kid was backed up against the wall with his hands raised and his face doing the terrible stillness of a child who'd learned not to cry in front of certain adults. She didn't think. She went out the kitchen door. The gravel was cold under her feet. She'd been wearing socks, no shoes, and the air hit her like a wall after 2 days of climate-controlled interior. One of the men heard her and turned, and she didn't give him time to react. "Hey!" She stepped between the kid and the 2 men. "Back up. Lady, you need to go inside." "Who is he?" She looked at the kid without looking away from the man, which was logistically impossible, but she managed it somehow. "What did he do?" "He was on the property. You need to—" "He's 10 years old." She turned fully to face the man who'd spoken, which meant putting her back to the other one. She was aware of how bad this was tactically. She also couldn't make herself move. "He's standing here with his hands up. What exactly are you planning to do with that?" "Serena." Lucian's voice came from the doorway she'd just exited. She turned. He was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. He looked at the 2 men. "Let the kid go." The man who'd spoken opened his mouth. "Let him go," Lucian said again. Same tone, no louder. But the man closed his mouth. The kid bolted. She heard his feet on the gravel and then silence, and she stood in the cold with her heart slamming against her ribs and her socks soaking through and looked at Lucien. "And inside," he said. She went. He didn't lecture her. She'd expected a lecture. Or worse, the kind of quiet, measured dressing down that was more humiliating than anything he could have shouted. Instead, he handed her a towel for her feet and poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine she'd already figured out and sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "Who was he?" she asked. "Local kid. Likes to cut through the property. He's been warned before." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "My men were going to put a scare in him and send him home." "Your men have guns." "Yes. A 9-year-old doesn't need a gun to scare him. He needs—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter." "No. Finish." She looked at him. "He needs someone to tell him to go home and lock the door and stay out of this neighborhood. Not 2 armed men against a wall." Lucian looked at his coffee. Something moved in his face and then stopped. "Noted," he said. They sat in silence for a moment. It was a different kind of silence than the room with the cold fireplace. Less charged, almost ordinary, which somehow made her more uncomfortable than any of the rest of it had. "You walked out of the house," he said. "I know. I told you. You told me I wouldn't try to leave. I wasn't leaving. I was going out to the garden. The garden is on the other side." "I got turned around," she said flatly. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he exhaled, not quite a laugh, but almost, and said nothing. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask?" "The thing my brother took. You said it's not about money. You said it has a different kind of value." She set her cup down. "I want you to tell me what it actually is." "Why?" "Because if I'm going to be held here while you wait for him to show up, I should at least understand what I'm in the middle of." "That's a dangerous kind of curiosity." "I'm already in danger. Might as well be informed." He studied her. She held his gaze and waited. "Files," he said finally. "Digital and physical. Documents covering a long chain of transactions, communications, and agreements between people who have a great deal to lose if those documents surface." He set his own cup down. "Not my people. Or not primarily. People in positions that the public would recognize." "Politicians," she said. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. "And my brother got his hands on them somehow." "Your brother had been working adjacent to an operation I was running without my knowledge," Lucien said. "Apparently for some time. Someone allowed it. I don't yet know who. And when he took the files, he made himself a target for every entity with a name in them," Lucien said, "which includes people who would not hesitate to remove anyone connected to him, including his sister." The coffee was hot, and she needed something to do with her hands, so she drank it. "So you're not just holding me here to flush Nolan out?" "No. You're keeping me here because if I'm out there, I'm easier to kill." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She set the cup down carefully. She thought about Nolan, charming, reckless, stupid Nolan, and what he might have thought he was doing. Blackmail, leverage, or something else, something she didn't have enough information to imagine yet. "There's a laptop in the study," she said. "Offline. I saw it through the door this morning." "And?" "I want to use it." He frowned. "For what?" "I used to do financial reconstruction," she said, "for companies going through bankruptcy. It means I can look at a chain of transactions, even partial records, and tell you where the gaps are, where money moved that shouldn't have, and who signed off on what." She kept her voice steady. "If these files are what you say they are, I might be able to help you understand what my brother actually has, which means you'll understand what everyone else is so afraid of." Lucien looked at her for a long time. "You never mentioned that. You never asked." Another silence. Outside, the garden was gray and still. Somewhere inside the house, a door closed. "I'll think about it," he said. She nodded. She'd expected that. She'd also noticed, in the pause before he said it, something shift in his expression. Not softening exactly, but a crack in the surface, just for a second. And she filed that away with everything else she'd been collecting since they'd brought her here. She was not a hostage sitting still. She was beginning to understand the walls. 3 days passed. Lucien let her use the laptop. She didn't know what she expected to find. Partial transaction records. Maybe. Something fragmented and incomplete that would take weeks to parse. What she found instead, working from a single file Lucien had his accountant pull and sanitize before giving it to her, was a pattern so clean and deliberate that she sat back from the screen and actually said nothing for almost a full minute. "What?" said the man standing behind her. Not Lucien. A younger one, dark-eyed, distrustful, who'd been assigned to watch her work and clearly considered this assignment beneath him. "These aren't laundering records," she said. "What?" "This," she pointed at the screen, "this isn't laundering. This is a payroll. Someone has been receiving payments for years. Regular, structured, masked as consulting fees and real estate commissions, but the pattern is..." She stopped. "Who does this routing number belong to?" "I can't tell you that." "Get Lucien." He hesitated. She turned and looked at him. "Get Lucien." He left. She turned back to the screen and kept working, and by the time Lucien appeared in the doorway, she'd found 3 more chains, all running to the same endpoint, all masked slightly differently, but using a tell, a rounding pattern, a specific interval, that whoever built this system had clearly not expected anyone to notice. She showed him. He stood behind her and looked at the screen for a long time without saying anything. "You can read this?" he said. "I built systems like this," she said, "a long time ago, in a different life, for a company that was trying to hide how bad things were before they crashed." She didn't look at him. "I know what it looks like when someone knows money well enough to make it disappear. And this endpoint." He leaned forward close enough that she could hear him breathing. "What does it tell you?" "It tells me," she said carefully, "that whoever is on the other end of these payments has been running both sides of several operations that are supposed to be in opposition, ostensibly on opposite sides." She turned to look at him. His face was very close. She held her position. "Which means your mole isn't just leaking to law enforcement." His jaw tightened. "Your mole," she said, "is law enforcement." The silence that followed was the longest she'd sat in since they'd brought her here. Lucien straightened up slowly. He moved to the window. She watched him process it, the controlled stillness, the way his hands at his sides went very still. Then he turned. "You found this in 3 days. The pattern was there. My accountants have had these files for weeks." "Your accountants were looking for what they expected to find," she said. "I didn't know what I was looking for. Sometimes that's better." He looked at her. Not the calculating look from the first night, something different, something that she recognized distantly as the expression of someone who has just been surprised against their will and isn't sure whether to be grateful or unsettled. "Stay on it," he said. "I need more files." "You'll get them." He moved toward the door. "Lucien." He stopped. She hesitated, then said it anyway. "Whoever this person is, they know my brother took the evidence. And if they know he has it, they know what he can prove." She watched him. "They'll move against Nolan before you find him, not to get the files back, to make sure he never gets a chance to explain where he got them." A muscle in Lucien's jaw moved. "I know." "Then you need to find him faster." "I know that too." He left. She turned back to the screen and kept working, and didn't let herself think about what she'd just said, or what it meant, or the fact that she'd just spent the better part of 3 days becoming genuinely useful to the most dangerous man in the city. She thought about Nolan instead, about the way he'd called her 2 weeks ago, voice strange and compressed, saying he needed a few days, about how she'd told him she couldn't keep doing this, about how he'd said very quietly, "I know. This is the last thing. I promise." She'd heard that before. She hadn't known then what he'd meant by it this time. Now, staring at a payment chain that ended somewhere it shouldn't, she was starting to wonder if her brother hadn't been running from a debt at all. She was starting to wonder if he'd been running towards something, and if that were true, if Nolan had actually meant for this to happen, had planned it, had placed her here deliberately as a piece in something larger, then she didn't know yet whether to call that love or the worst thing he'd ever done to her. The cursor blinked on the screen. Outside the study window, somewhere in the house, she heard voices rising, then a door slamming, then one of Lucien's men saying something fast and clipped that she couldn't make out, then silence, then footsteps. Fast ones. Coming toward the study. She had just enough time to close the window she'd been working in before the door opened and the dark-eyed man from earlier appeared in the frame, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on any of them yet. Something between urgency and fear. "You need to come with me," he said. "Why? What happened?" He looked over his shoulder, then back at her. "We found your brother." She stood up. Her chair scraped back too loud in the quiet room. "Is he alive?" she said. The man's face did something complicated. "Come with me," he said again, and didn't answer the question. They found Nolan in a parking structure on the east side of the city, 3 levels underground, slumped against a concrete pillar with a phone in one hand and a bullet crease along his left shoulder that had bled enough to soak through his jacket and dry dark and stiff against the fabric. He was alive. Barely the word for it, but technically accurate. Serena learned this in pieces, standing in the hallway outside the study, while the dark-eyed man, she'd learned his name was Cass, gave her information in the clipped, rationed way of someone who'd been told to say enough, but not everything. Nolan had been found by two of Lucien's people doing a sweep of a zone they'd flagged 3 days ago. He hadn't called out. He'd been sitting there in the dark, apparently conscious, apparently choosing not to move. "Why?" she said. "Don't know yet." "Is he here? Did you bring him here?" Cass looked at her. "Not yet." "What does that mean?" "It means Mr. DeMarco is deciding." She wanted to push past him and find Lucien herself. She almost did. Instead, she stood in the hallway with her arms crossed and her jaw set and waited because she'd spent the last 3 days learning the geography of this place, and she understood now that certain moves cost more than they gained. Lucien came to her, not to the study. He sent Cass to bring her downstairs, to a room she hadn't been in before, off the back of the main corridor, with a long table and a dozen chairs and a whiteboard along one wall covered in notations she couldn't read from the doorway. 4 men were already inside. None of them looked at her when she entered. Lucien was standing at the far end of the table. He looked like he hadn't slept. She would have thought she was projecting, except that she could see it. The slight looseness around his eyes, the way his shirt was rolled at the sleeves in a way that suggested he'd been wearing it since yesterday. "Your brother is being transported now," he said. "He'll be here in 40 minutes. What kind of shape is he in?" "Stable? The wound isn't serious." He looked at her directly. "Before he arrives, I need to know if you've had any contact with him in the past 3 weeks. Any at all. A text, a call, anything." "You have my phone." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "No," she said. "The last time I spoke to him was 2 weeks before your people took me. He called. Told me he needed a few days." "Did he say why?" "He never says why. That's the pattern." She paused. "He said it was the last thing. Those were his words." "Last thing meaning what?" "I don't know. I didn't ask." One of the men at the table shifted. She didn't know his name. Older than the rest, heavy across the shoulders, with a face that had been through several restructurings and come out the other side still functional but permanently rearranged. He'd been watching her since she walked in. "She could have tipped him," the man said. "Found a way to get a message out." "To what end?" Lucien said. "She knew we were closing in." "She could have—" "I found your leak 2 days ago," Serena said. She turned to look at the man directly. "Did you see Lucien's face when I showed him? Because I did. So unless you think he was faking surprise, I'm not your problem." The man's expression didn't change much, but his jaw moved. "Costa," Lucien said quietly. The man looked away. She filed the name. Costa. The set of his shoulders, the way he'd been the first to speak against her presence. She filed all of it. "When Nolan gets here," Lucien said, "you'll be in the room." She blinked. "Why?" "Because he'll talk to you. He won't talk to me, not right away. People with a guilty conscience who've been sitting alone in the dark for—" He paused. "How long was he there?" 30-some hours, Cass said from near the door. "Estimates." "He wasn't moving. Someone brought him food, maybe." "Who?" she said. "Good question," Lucien said. The room went quiet in a way that told her everyone in it had already been asking that question and not finding an answer they liked. Nolan arrived looking like a man who'd decided to let something happen to him. That was the only way she could describe it. She'd seen her brother scared before, seen him wrung out, seen him in the specific kind of shattered that came from losing badly at something he'd bet everything on. This wasn't that. He walked in, not carried, the shoulder wrapped under a fresh bandage and his arm in a sling, and looked around the room with the hollow eyes of someone who'd already done the accounting and found the balance sheet catastrophic. Then he saw her. "Sari," he said. His voice came out wrong, too thin. "Don't," she said. He closed his mouth. They sat him down. Lucien took the chair at the head of the table. Serena sat to the left of her brother, close enough to touch him, but she didn't. Costa remained standing near the wall. The other men arranged themselves, and the room contracted around the table. "You're going to start talking," Lucien said. "Right now, from the beginning." Nolan looked at the table. "How much do you already know?" Enough that what you leave out will matter more than what you include. A breath. Nolan rolled his good shoulder, winced. I was working for Marcus Hale. The name landed differently on different faces. Lucian's didn't change. Costa straightened slightly against the wall. Cass, near the door, went very still. For how long? Lucian said. 14 months. What were you doing for him? Moving documents, physical and digital, between Hale and several intermediaries. Nolan's voice steadied as he spoke, the way people's voices do when they've rehearsed the confession, even if they couldn't bring themselves to give it. I didn't know what they were at first. I told myself that. I thought it was financial, corporate stuff. He looked up briefly and then back down. Then 6 months in, I moved a package and part of it came loose in transit and I saw... He stopped. I saw enough. What did you see? Lucius said. Correspondence between Hale and a federal task force director named Voss. Nolan said the name like it cost him. About your operation, shipment times, personnel, routes. He looked up fully this time. Hale wasn't just paying Voss. Voss was feeding Hale everything, and Hale was using it to time his moves against my network, Lucian said, and against 2 other families. Nolan exhaled. He was letting the task force burn everyone else while he stayed clean. He'd given them just enough, let them take down operations that competed with him, so they'd keep protecting his. Serena looked at Lucian. His face was a wall. He already knew some of this, she could tell, but not all of it, not the structure of it, not the specific names. The money you took, Lucian said, from my account. Explain that. Nolan's jaw worked. I needed to move fast. I took what I could access to buy time with someone who could help me authenticate the documents. I didn't... He stopped. I know how that sounds. It sounds, Lucian said, like theft. It was theft, Nolan said. I'm not arguing that. I'm telling you the context. And my sister? Nolan looked at Serena. She looked back at him and kept her face as still as she could manage, which took everything she had. I didn't know they'd take her, he said. I swear. You knew I'd come after your family, Lucien said. That's standard. Everyone knows that. Nolan flinched. I thought I'd be back before... You thought, Lucien said. Just those 2 words. The silence after them was the loudest thing in the room. Serena breathed through her nose. She could feel the heat climbing up her throat. Not tears, not yet. She wouldn't do that here. But the specific combination of fury and grief that came from watching someone you loved prove, for the 100th time, that they were exactly who you'd always feared they were. The documents, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Where are they now? Nolan looked at her. Something moved in his face that she couldn't name. Most of them, he said. I have most of them. Most? Lucien said. I had to give something to authenticate, to prove what I had was real. Nolan's hand on the table curled. I gave copies to someone I thought I could trust. Who? Lucien said. A man named Rourke. The name hit the room like a thrown stone into glass. Costa pushed off the wall. Cass said something very quietly under his breath. Lucian's expression didn't change, but his stillness shifted quality, became harder, became colder, in a way that made the temperature of the room feel different. Damien Rourke, Lucian said. He told me he wanted to use it, that he had connections who could get it to the right people, journalists, legal... Damien Rourke, Lucian said again. Slower this time. Does not have journalists. He has guns, and he has territory, and he has been trying to collapse my operation for 4 years. He leaned forward. You gave Damien Rourke evidence that implicates every significant power structure in this city, including people who currently keep him in check. Do you understand what you did? Nolan's face had gone gray. I didn't know. No, Lucian said. You didn't. He stood. Costa. Yeah. Find out what Rourke already knows, how fast and how far. He moved toward the door. And call Chen. Tell him the Voss situation is confirmed. Costa was already moving. The other men followed, the room emptying fast with the efficiency of people who'd been waiting for direction and now had it. Cass stayed near the door. Nolan reached out and caught Serena's wrist. She looked at his hand, then at his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't," she said. "Not now." "Sari, She pulled her wrist free, not roughly. She didn't have the heart for roughness, but firmly. She stood up. "You need to tell them everything, every detail, every conversation with Rourke, every copy you made, every person you contacted." She looked at him and tried to find the brother she knew under the wreckage of what he'd done. And she could find him, which was somehow the worst part. "Don't hold anything back trying to protect yourself. There's nothing left to protect." He looked at her with eyes that were too bright. "Are you okay? Have they—" "I'm fine," she said. "I've been fine." She picked up the notepad she'd brought with her. "I need to go." "You need to go," he repeated, like he didn't understand what she'd said. "I'm working on something," she said, "and now I have more to work on." She left before he could say anything else. She didn't look back. She made it all the way to the hallway before she stopped and stood against the wall with her eyes closed for exactly 10 seconds, breathing, and then she opened them and kept moving. The study felt different after that, smaller. She sat in front of the laptop with the payment chain still open on screen, but now she had names, Hale, Voss, and names changed everything about how a pattern read. She started over, not from scratch, but from a different angle, pulling on the threads she'd left loose because she hadn't known what connected them. Hale's payments to Voss were buried well. Whoever had set up the system was good, better than good. This was professional. This was someone who understood regulatory blind spots with a specificity that suggested either legal or financial training at a high level. But Serena had learned accounting from the inside of a catastrophe. She'd spent 3 years after her father's company imploded reconstructing the exact mechanisms by which it had been hollowed out. First because she'd had to, and then because she couldn't stop, because understanding the machine was the only thing that had made the aftermath bearable. She knew what to look for. By the time Lucienne appeared in the doorway, she didn't know how long she'd been working. The light outside the window had shifted from gray to dark. She had a second chart drawn on paper next to the laptop, connections mapped in 3 colors, and a single name circled twice at the center of it. She heard him come in, didn't look up. "Pull a chair over," she said. A pause. Then the sound of a chair moving. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which she noted and set aside. "Hale is the money source," she said. "We knew that. But Voss isn't his only contact inside the task force. Look," she pointed at the chart. "These 2 routing chains, they run parallel. Same interval pattern, same rounding tail, different endpoints. Voss is endpoint A. Endpoint B. I can't resolve yet, not without more data, but the structure is identical, which means it's the same architect. Same person built both channels." Lucian studied the chart, which means there are 2 people inside the task force. Or 1 person with 2 accounts, but the transaction volume is different. Endpoint B is receiving less than Voss, which suggests a different role. She tapped the circled name. "This entity here appears in both chains as an intermediary. Shell company, construction, registered in Delaware. Marcus Hale is listed as a passive investor." Lucian went still. "He's not hiding it," she said. "That's what's interesting. It's there in the registration. He's a passive investor in a construction company that also appears in your transaction records. 3 payments last year. Materials invoices that don't match any project I can find publicly." She looked at him. "He's been moving money through your operation." Lucienne was quiet for a long moment. "Show me the invoices." She pulled them up. He leaned forward and read them, and she watched his face, and for the first time since she'd been brought here, she saw something in his expression that wasn't controlled. Not anger. Anger she'd seen in the controlled version, the stillness that was colder than any raised voice. This was something older than anger, something that looked like the specific exhaustion of a person who has just found out that the ground they've been standing on was never solid. "This was inside my network," he said, "for at least 2 years based on the earliest invoice date. And no one caught it." She didn't answer. It wasn't a question. He stood up. She tracked him to the window, the same window where she'd watched the garden go from light to dark, and he stood there with his back to her and his hands in his pockets and said nothing. Lucienne. She waited until he turned. Whoever built these channels had to have access to your financial records, not external observation. Access. They knew your billing codes, your vendor formats. She held his gaze. This isn't Rourke. Rourke didn't build this. No, he said. He didn't. It means Hale has someone inside my house, he said, and has had them for 2 years. His jaw was very tight, which means everything that's been fed to the task force, every shipment they've tracked, every personnel movement they've known about, it didn't come from Voss working an investigation. It came from someone who was standing next to me. She nodded. He turned back to the window. She watched the line of his shoulders, the specific weight of what was happening in them. You need to tell me, she said carefully, who had access to these accounts? A long pause. 3 people, he said. Cass, my financial director, a woman named Reyes. A pause. And Costa. The name sat in the air between them. She thought about the meeting. Costa pushing off the wall when Rourke's name was said. Costa's eyes on her from the moment she'd entered the room. Costa being the first to suggest she might have tipped Nolan. She thought about what it meant when the person most focused on someone else's guilt was trying very hard not to look at their own. She was about to say it when the window behind Lucien shattered. Not a bullet. She registered that in the first half-second, the glass came in rather than going out, pressure from outside. And then there was smoke, acrid and instant, and the room was full of it before she could push back from the desk. She heard shouting from somewhere deeper in the house. She heard a door slam, then running. Lucien was across the room in 2 strides, his hand around her arm, pulling her toward the hallway. Stay close, he said. His voice had dropped into something flat and operational that she'd never heard from him before. What is this? Close, he said again. They were in the hallway, and there were men materializing from both directions. Lucien's people, weapons drawn, moving fast. And she felt the press of bodies and the sharp edge of panic trying to find purchase in her chest, and she breathed against it, breathed through it. One of the men, not Cass, she didn't see Cass, grabbed Lucien's shoulder and said something close to his ear, and Lucien's face went very still. He turned and looked at her. Your brother, he said. What? He's gone. She heard it clearly. The words were simple enough, she understood them individually, but they assembled themselves wrong, in the wrong order, into something that didn't make sense against the picture she had of Nolan sitting pale and exhausted at that table 2 hours ago. How? She said. Someone came for him. Lucien's hand was still around her arm. Costa's car is gone. She stared at him. Costa took Nolan, she said. Lucien didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was in the smoke still filtering under the study door, in the broken window, in the shouting somewhere below them that was reorganizing itself from alarm into the particular controlled fury of people realizing what they'd just lost and what it meant. Costa had built those payment channels. Costa had been feeding Hale for 2 years, and now Costa had her brother, which meant the person who'd been standing next to Lucien the whole time, who knew every security rotation and every blind spot in this house, had just handed Nolan, and everything Nolan knew, to Marcus Hale. She thought about Lucien's words from days ago. Everyone with a name in those files will come for anyone connected to Nolan. She thought about what Nolan's voice had sounded like saying Rourke's name. She thought about the pieces of the chart on the desk inside that smoke-filled room and the circled name at the center, and how she'd been on the edge of saying Costa's name out loud when the window had broken. The timing hadn't been coincidence. Someone had been listening. He knows what I found, she said. Her voice was remarkably calm. She found that almost interesting. Costa knows I can prove it. That's why... Yes, Lucien said. He has to get rid of the evidence. My brother is the evidence. She looked at Lucien and said the rest plainly because there was no version where softening it helped either of them. Nolan's the only person left who can testify to what he saw. As long as Nolan is alive and talking, Hale is exposed. As long as Hale is exposed, Voss is exposed. And if Voss goes down, half of law enforcement's leadership goes with him, Lucien said, which means they all need my brother dead. She watched Lucien absorb that, watched him stand in the middle of his own hallway with smoke seeping under the door and his people moving around him, and process the full weight of what the last 4 years of his operation had actually been. A carefully managed theater with hail pulling strings he'd never been able to see. And she watched him, in the space of maybe 3 seconds, set all of that aside. "Get her to the East Wing," he said to the man on his right. Then he looked at her. "Don't go anywhere. I need to know what you're going to do. I'm going to get your brother back." "And then?" "And then," he said, "we're going to finish what Nolan started." His eyes held hers for exactly 1 moment too long. The kind of moment that didn't happen accidentally between two people who'd been in the same building for 5 days and had spent most of it watching each other very carefully. "I need you in this. What you found." "I know," she said. "Can you keep going?" She looked at him. She thought about the chart on the desk. She thought about the payment chains and the circled name and the 2 years of damage Costa had done while standing close enough to be trusted. She thought about her brother in the back of Costa's car going somewhere she didn't know, with people who needed him silent. "Yes," she said. "Good." He turned away and she saw him step back into the role that fit him like a second skin. The command, the certainty, the controlled forward movement. And she understood, watching it, that this was a man who had been managing impossible situations for so long that the machinery of it was automatic, that it cost him something, that the cost didn't show because he'd learned not to let it. She let the man guide her toward the East Wing. She carried the chart in her head, every line of it, every connection. Costa's name was written nowhere physically. The paper was still on that desk in the smoke-filled study. But she held it clearly, the structure of his betrayal mapped in 3 colors behind her eyes. She also held something else, something that had been sitting at the edge of everything she'd processed in the last 5 days, and that she hadn't let herself look at directly until now. The chart had 3 endpoints. She'd found 2, Voss and the second account she hadn't resolved yet. She told Lucien there were 2 people inside the task force, or 1 person with 2 accounts. But that wasn't quite what the data said. What the data said, if she read it the way she'd been trained to read financial structures, the way that stripped away the surface logic and looked at the underlying movement, was that endpoint B wasn't inside the task force at all. Endpoint B was somewhere else entirely. And the transaction volume, the thing she'd read as suggesting a secondary role, told a different story if you looked at it from the other direction. Endpoint B wasn't receiving less than Voss because they had a smaller role. They were receiving less because they'd been receiving payments for longer, because the amounts had been compressed over time to reduce visibility, the way you compress something when you were afraid someone was learning to look for it. Endpoint B had been in place before Voss, before the task force connection, before any of the architecture she'd mapped so far. Endpoint B was where this had started, and she didn't know yet whose name was there, but she was starting to think she knew whose handwriting it was. She didn't sleep. She sat in the East Wing room, different from the first one, smaller, no garden view, just a window that faced the interior courtyard where 2 men stood in rotation through the night and worked on the chart from memory. She'd asked for paper. Someone brought it without comment. She'd asked for a pen. Same. She sat at the narrow desk and reconstructed everything from the inside of her head, drawing the chains out long and clean. And when she got to endpoint B, she left a blank circle with 3 question marks inside it and stared at it until her eyes burned. The transaction compression was the key. She kept coming back to it. In financial fraud, compression over time meant one of 2 things. Either the recipient had gotten greedy early and then frightened, scaling back voluntarily to reduce exposure, or someone above them in the structure had ordered the reduction because the recipient had become a risk, or because the architecture was being restructured around them, or because they'd served their purpose and were being quietly sidelined before they could become a liability. Option 2 meant endpoint B didn't know they were being managed out. Option 2 meant endpoint B might not even know what they were part of anymore. She was still sitting there at 4 in the morning when her door opened and Lucien walked in. He looked worse than he had in the hallway. Not visibly. His face was still controlled, still the same flat, certain geometry. But there was something in the way he moved that had changed, a tightness in the economy of it, like a machine running 10 degrees hotter than it was rated for. He looked at the paper on the desk. "You reconstructed it," he said. "I needed to keep working." He pulled the other chair over and sat, not beside her this time, across, facing her. She noticed the difference without commenting on it. "Did you find Nolan?" she said. "Not yet. Costa's car was abandoned in the warehouse district. They transferred. We lost the trail at the interchange." He said it flatly, the way people reported bad news when they'd been trained to report bad news without effect. "We'll find them." "How long?" "I don't know." She looked at him. "You always know." "Not tonight." He looked at the chart. "What did you find?" She told him about Endpoint B. She laid it out the same way she would have presented a reconstruction to a board of directors. Clean, sequential, the data first, and the interpretation after. She watched his face as she talked. He was good at stillness, but not perfect. And when she got to the part about the compression pattern, something moved in his jaw. "The compression started approximately 28 months ago," she said, "which is roughly when you brought Cass into the inner structure." He went very still. "I'm not saying it's Cass," she said carefully. "I'm saying the timeline correlates. Whoever Endpoint B is, their payments began being reduced around the same time your inner circle changed composition. Either they panicked because new eyes were getting close to the accounts, or someone restructured deliberately to manage them out. Or, Lucien said, someone new came in who needed the original contact to step back." She hadn't considered that angle. She turned it over. "A handoff," she said. "Original contact brought in Costa, then voluntarily reduced their own exposure because Costa took over the active work." "Meaning Endpoint B isn't someone who was sidelined," he said. "They're someone who chose to become invisible because they'd already gotten what they needed." She looked at the blank circle on the paper. "What did they get?" Lucien stood up. He moved to the window, the courtyard, the two men below, the gray pre-dawn light starting to press at the edges of the sky. He stood there for a moment with his back to her. "I need to show you something," he said, "and I need you to tell me what it means because I've been looking at it for 6 hours and I can't read it the way you can." He reached into his jacket and set a folder on the desk. Not thick, maybe 12 pages, some printed, some photocopied, one handwritten. She pulled it toward her. The first 3 pages were transaction records she hadn't seen before. Different structure from the chain she'd been working with. Older formatting, earlier dates. She scanned them and felt her attention sharpen in the way it did when something resolved from noise into signal. "Where did these come from?" she said. "Reyes, his financial director. She found them an hour ago in a backup archive. Physical copies, not digital. Someone had put them there a long time ago." She kept reading. The 4th page was a contract. Services rendered, consulting, the language standard and hollow, with a signature at the bottom. She looked at the signature. She looked at it for a long time. "Lucien," she said, "I know. This says, I know what it says." She set the page down. She picked it up again. The signature was clear. The date was clear. 14 years ago, before Lucien's operation had its current shape, before the syndicate had consolidated, when he was building something from the ruins of what his predecessor had left. A consulting contract. Services rendered for an entity that matched, in its structure and its registration details, the parent company of the shell she'd circled on the chart. The signature on the contract was her father's. Her father, Daniel Vale. Deceased. Bankrupt. The man who had, in the last 3 years of his life, lost everything in a collapse so total that she'd spent years afterward trying to understand how it had happened so fast. She understood now. The folder in her hands told her, in the specific language of numbers and dates and legal signatures, that her father hadn't lost everything in the collapse. He had been the collapse. Or rather, he'd been part of the mechanism that had caused it. A consulting contract with an entity connected to Hale's early operation. Payments received. Work done. And then the payments had stopped. Right around the time the bankruptcy hit, right around the time everything her family had built went underwater so fast it felt like the ground had opened. She thought about Nolan, 14 months working for Marcus Hale. She'd believed him when he said he hadn't known what the documents were at first. She stopped believing it now. Did you know? She said. Her voice came out strange, hollow. No. Lucien turned from the window. I didn't know your father's name was in this until an hour ago. I didn't connect the Vale name to this operation when I took you. It's a common enough name. I had no reason to. But Nolan did, she said. Lucien was quiet. Nolan knew, she said. Not a question, not anymore. Because it assembled itself in the space of 3 seconds. Nolan's voice on the phone, this is the last thing, I promise. Nolan working for Hale for 14 months, not because he'd stumbled into it, but because he'd gone looking. Because their father's name was somewhere in those records, and Nolan had spent years trying to find it. And when he wasn't trying to steal leverage, she said. He was trying to get proof of what happened to our father. What Hale did to him. Serena, Hale used our father. She heard her voice go flat and didn't try to stop it. He used him in the early operation, and then when he became a liability, he destroyed him. The bankruptcy wasn't bad luck. It wasn't bad management. She pushed the folder away from her and stood up. Someone engineered it. There's no direct evidence in those pages that... Oh, I don't need direct evidence. She pressed both hands on the desk. I've spent 4 years reconstructing bankruptcies. I know what a natural collapse looks like, and I know what a manufactured one looks like, and I should have seen it 6 years ago, and I didn't because I was 22 and I thought numbers didn't lie. She straightened. They don't. People do. And I was looking at the numbers without asking who'd arranged them. Lucien crossed the room and stood in front of her. Not close. A respectful distance. The width of the desk between them. He looked at her the way she'd learned he looked at things he was assessing without wanting to be seen assessing them. Your brother knew this going in, he said. Yes. Which means he wasn't just taking documents. He was taking the specific documents that proved what Hale did to your family, and when he copied them to Rourke, he made a mistake, she said. A bad one. He thought Rourke would help him use them. He didn't know Rourke would... She stopped. Did Rourke know what he had? I think, Lucien said carefully, that Rourke knew exactly what he had. And I think Rourke has no interest in exposing Hale. I think Rourke wants to use what he has to replace Hale, not destroy him. Replace him. She absorbed that. So Rourke isn't going to take the evidence to journalists. He's going to take it to Hale and offer it back in exchange for territory. Or he's going to take it to Voss and offer Hale's head in exchange for protection while he moves into the vacuum. Lucien's jaw was very tight. Either way, your brother is the loose end. He's the one person who can say what he saw, what he took, and who he gave it to. Without Nolan's testimony, the documents are harder to authenticate. They're not impossible to authenticate, she said. I can... Serena. His voice stopped her. She looked at him. His face was doing the thing again. The crack in the surface, just for a second, the controlled man briefly visible as something less controlled and more human. Costa has your brother. Hale almost certainly knows by now what you found on his accounts. And Rourke is moving. All of that is happening simultaneously. I know. If Hale's people find you, I know, she said again, more sharply. You're not just a hostage anymore. He held her gaze. You're evidence. You're the person who can read those files and explain them to anyone who needs it explained. That makes you as much of a target as your brother. She'd known that. She'd known it at some level since the study, since the broken window, since the smoke. She'd let herself not say it because saying it out loud used up space she needed for the work. Then we move faster, she said. His phone rang. He looked at the screen and something in his face shifted, the controlled blankness becoming something specific and hard. He answered it. What? She watched him listen, watched the line of his body change. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic man. But she'd spent 5 days watching him, and she could read the micro-adjustments. The shoulders, the hand that wasn't holding the phone going flat against his thigh. He hung up. He looked at her. They found Costa's car, he said. Wrong. She didn't understand. Wrong how? Costa's car was in the warehouse district, he said. That was accurate. What we didn't find in the first sweep was what was in the trunk. A pause. One of Rourke's men, dead. Approximately 2 hours. She stared at him. Costa killed a Rourke soldier. Which means Costa isn't working for Hale, Lucien said. Or not only for Hale. He's working for Rourke, she said. He's been feeding both of them, Lucien said. Or he was working for Rourke all along, and feeding Hale was part of Rourke's play, letting Hale weaken my operation while Rourke positioned to take both of us. The scale of it hit her. Not just Lucien's mole. Not just Hale's dirty task force director. A 4-year orchestration with Costa as the hinge point between two rival forces, both of them using him to erode Lucien from opposite sides. And now Costa killed one of Rourke's men, she said. Which means, Costa is running, Lucien said. He's not delivering Nolan to Rourke. He's trying to get out from under both of them. He took your brother because Nolan is the one asset that everyone wants, which means Nolan is the only thing Costa can sell. To who? She said. If he's burned with Hale and burned with Rourke, to whoever will take him, Lucien said. There are 4 other power structures in this city who would pay significantly for what your brother knows. One of them is currently sitting across a negotiating table from the federal task force trying to work out an immunity deal. He said it with a flatness that was its own kind of anger. If Costa gets Nolan in front of the wrong people, the information doesn't get used to expose anyone. It gets buried in a deal. Everyone Hale has been protecting stays protected. Your father's records disappear into a sealed agreement that no one will ever see. She thought about her father, about the specific weight of the word manufactured, about what it felt like to rebuild your understanding of a loss you'd already processed, already grieved, already built scar tissue over, and find out the scar tissue was covering the wrong wound. Where would Costa go? She said. We're working that. I'm asking you specifically. He looked at her. I have 3 locations flagged. We're moving on all 3 simultaneously in... He checked his watch. 19 minutes. I'm coming. No. Lucien? You're not field trained, you're a target, and I need you here working on endpoint B, he said. If we find Nolan, and he needs to make a case to someone fast, you're the person who can put it together in a way that anyone will understand. That's more useful than, he's my brother. I know. If something happens to him while I'm sitting here with a pen, then we'll deal with that, he said. And the way he said it, not dismissive, not cold, but the particular steadiness of someone who had learned to say hard things without letting them destroy the moment, stopped her. I'm going to bring him back, he said, not because of what he knows, because he's yours. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Go, she said. He went. She sat down in front of the paper. She picked up the pen. She found the blank circle with the 3 question marks, and she stared at it and made herself think. Endpoint B, 14 years of compressed payments, a connection to the shell company and the consulting contract. Whoever they were, they'd been in Hale's orbit longer than anyone else in this chain, longer than Voss, longer than Costa, longer than the task force arrangement. They were the foundation of the architecture, the original contact. She thought about what Lucien had said, a handoff. Original contact brought in Costa, then stepped back. That meant Endpoint B knew Costa, had introduced him, vouched for him, given him the access he needed to embed himself inside Lucien's operation, which meant Endpoint B was close enough to the inner structure to make that introduction credible, which meant Endpoint B wasn't just someone in Hale's world. They were someone in Lucien's world too. She wrote that down. She drew a line between the blank circle and the box she'd labeled Costa. She drew a second line between the blank circle and the box she'd labeled Hale. She sat with those 2 lines for a moment and then slowly drew a third line, between the blank circle and a new box she hadn't written before. She labeled it Vale, her father, the consulting contract, the bankruptcy, the manufactured collapse of everything her family had. Endpoint B had a connection to all 3, Hale, Costa, and her family. She set the pen down. She picked up the folder Lucien had left on the desk and went back through it page by page, slower this time, not looking for the obvious markers, but for the texture underneath, the formatting choices, the routing preferences, the small structural decisions that people made without realizing they were signatures. On the 9th page, she found it, a routing number, partially redacted but not completely. 1 block of digits still visible in a photocopy where the redaction hadn't fully taken. She'd seen that partial sequence before, not in the files she'd been given. Somewhere else. Somewhere close. She stood up. She went to the door and knocked. The man outside, but one of Lucien's, rotating, opened it. "I need access to the financial records from the study," she said. "The full archive, not the sanitized version." He looked uncertain. Mr. DeMarco said, "Mr. DeMarco is in the field. I need those records in the next 10 minutes, or the work I'm doing tonight is useless." She held his gaze. "He will want you to give them to me." He made a call. 30 seconds. He nodded and stepped aside. She was back at the desk with the full archive on a secured drive within 8 minutes. She found the matching routing sequence in less than 3. The partial number on the 9th page of Lucien's folder matched a routing identifier she'd written off 2 days ago as a processing error. A single anomalous transaction in Lucien's records from 4 years ago. Small amount, wrong format, the kind of thing that looked like a vendor data entry mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was a test. A small payment pushed through the system to verify access. A pilot transaction from endpoint B confirming that their channel into Lucien's financial network was open before they handed the architecture over to Costa. And it had a name attached, not a shell company, not a routing abstraction. An actual name, sitting there in a metadata field that the system had automatically populated and that no one had thought to strip because no one had thought to look at it as anything but an error. She read the name 3 times, then she sat very still for a while. Reyes, Lucien's financial director, the woman who had found the backup archive an hour ago. The woman who had brought him the folder with her father's consulting contract. The woman who had, in the act of appearing to help, just made sure that Lucien's attention was pointed at her father's name and away from the routing sequence on page 9. Reyes wasn't finding evidence. Reyes was managing what Lucien saw, and Reyes had been doing it for 4 years. She was still holding the pen. She set it down very deliberately. She thought about Lucien in the field right now, moving on 3 locations, with Reyes still inside the house, still with access to the financial archives, still, almost certainly, with a phone in her pocket that could reach Costa, or Hale, or anyone else who needed to know where Lucien was going tonight. She needed to reach him, now. No delay, no working through channels, no waiting to be sure. She went to the door again. The man outside turned. "I need to reach Lucien DeMarco directly," she said. "Right now. It's not about Nolan." The man read her face. Whatever he saw in it, it was enough. He reached for his radio. What came back from the radio was not Lucien's voice. It was Cass. And Cass sounded wrong in the specific way that Serena had learned to read in the last 6 days. Not the controlled urgency of managed crisis, but something underneath it. Something that sounded like a man working very hard to keep his voice from doing what it wanted to do. "Tell her to stay in that room," Cass said. "Tell her to lock the door and stay in that room and not move." The man with the radio looked at her. "Why?" she said. To the radio, not the man. "Cass, why?" A pause. Long enough that she could hear background sound through the transmission, movement, something mechanical, what might have been a vehicle. Then Cass's voice came back, quieter, with something in it that made the back of her neck go cold. "Rourke has him," Cass said. "They hit the second location before we got there. It wasn't Costa." She understood the first part. She asked about the second part anyway. "What do you mean it wasn't Costa?" Another pause. "Costa's dead," Cass said. "They found him in the location. He'd been there for 3 hours. Someone got to him before we did." He stopped. The background sound shifted. "Serena, your brother wasn't taken by Costa." She didn't breathe. "Costa was a setup," Cass said. "Someone in this house put your brother in Rourke's hands tonight and made it look like Costa. And Costa," his voice tightened, "Costa probably never knew he was going to take the fall for it." She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the door. "Where's Lucien?" she said. "On his way to the 3rd location." "The 3rd location is wrong," she said. "Cass, listen to me. The 3rd location is wrong. Reyes built the leak. Reyes has been running endpoint B for 4 years. She found those files tonight and gave them to Lucien to redirect him. And if she knows where he's going, a sound from the radio that wasn't words. Then, "How sure are you?" "Completely," she said. The routing sequence on page 9 of the folder she gave him matches a transaction in the archive from 4 years ago with her name in the metadata. I have it in front of me. Silence. "Cass," she said. "I'm trying to reach him," Cass said. "His phone is off. Field protocol." She stared at the wall. "Then we go to him," she said. "You are not—" "Reyes is still in this house," she said. "She knows I've been working. She knows what I can find. How long do you think it takes her to figure out I found it?" She picked up the folder and the papers from the desk. "If I stay in this room, I'm not safe. If Reyes is in this house, none of Lucien's people are safe. And if Lucien walks into that third location without knowing it's compromised, he—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. 30 seconds, Cass said. "I'll have a car at the east entrance." She was already moving. The hallway felt different at 4:30 in the morning. Longer. The sound of her own footsteps on the carpet felt too loud. She passed 2 of Lucien's men, and neither of them stopped her. Cass had clearly cleared her path. And she made it to the east entrance in under a minute, the folder pressed against her chest, the pen still somehow in her hand. The car was there. She got in. And in the 30 seconds before the driver pulled onto the road, she looked back at the house. Lit windows on the upper floors, the dark garden beyond, the stone wall she'd studied her first night here, and thought about how in 6 days this place had become the closest thing to a fixed point she had. How that was either absurd or honest, or both. Then she thought about Reyes, about 4 years, about her father's name on a contract that Reyes had put in front of Lucien tonight, deliberately, as misdirection. Which meant Reyes knew about her father, which meant the manufactured bankruptcy wasn't just Hale's operation. It had Reyes' fingerprints on it too. Her father hadn't just been used by an organized crime structure 14 years ago. He'd been used by a woman who was currently standing somewhere in that house with access to everything. She held the folder tighter. The car accelerated into the dark. And Serena Vale, who had spent her entire life cleaning up after everyone else's disasters, understood for the first time that she wasn't cleaning up anymore. She was moving toward the center of the storm instead of away from it, with a routing sequence and a folder full of evidence and the specific bone-deep calm of someone who has finally stopped being afraid of the thing that's been chasing them. Because the thing has a name now, and names were what she was best at. The waterfront came up fast through the windshield, a stretch of abandoned industrial port that the city had been promising to redevelop for 15 years and hadn't touched. The cranes standing dark against the pre-dawn sky like rusted monuments to something that had stopped working a long time ago. Serena counted 3 vehicles ahead of them on the access road before the driver killed the headlights and pulled behind a collapsed section of chain-link fencing. She was out of the car before it fully stopped, the folder still in her hand, the cold hitting her face like a flat palm. Cass was already there. He'd beaten them by 4 minutes, which meant he'd been moving before he'd finished talking to her on the radio, which meant some part of him had already known the third location was wrong before she'd confirmed it. She filed that away and didn't say it. "He's inside," Cass said, low, without preamble. "Warehouse C. We have 2 men with him, maybe 3. Rourke has the perimeter." "How many of Rourke's people?" 8 confirmed. More inside. Unknown. "And Nolan?" Cass's jaw moved. "Also inside. We think. We don't have eyes." She looked at the warehouse. 3 stories, corrugated steel siding gone orange with rust, windows on the upper level mostly intact but dark. A single light source visible through the ground floor loading bay, not overhead fluorescent, something portable, the kind of work light you set up fast and moved fast. The kind that said temporary occupation, not prepared position. Rourke hadn't planned this location. He'd improvised it, which meant something had gone wrong on his end too tonight, and he was running a moving operation instead of a prepared one, and that was either an advantage or a trap, and she didn't know which yet. "Reyes?" she said. "Handled." She looked at him. "She's contained," Cass said. "I made 3 calls from the car. She doesn't know that yet." He paused. "She tried to reach someone on an outside line 12 minutes ago. Blocked." His face was very still. I've known her for 6 years. She didn't offer anything for that. There was nothing that helped. Lucien needs to know about Reyes before he makes any move, she said. If she was feeding Rourke his position tonight, he knows something's wrong, Cass said. He went silent 20 minutes ago, which is either field protocol or he's already in contact with Rourke, and we don't know it yet. Can you get inside? Service entrance on the north side. My man said it's unwatched, for now. Then we go, she said. Cass looked at her. The look said several things, the main one being that she was a civilian with a folder of financial documents, and he was a man who'd been doing this for a decade, and these were not equivalent qualifications. She looked back at him with the specific expression she'd been developing over the last 6 days for exactly this kind of moment. You need the evidence physically present, she said. If Lucien is in there negotiating, or if Rourke is making a play, the documents are the only thing that changes the balance. Without them, you have a firefight. With them, you have leverage. She held up the folder. This is leverage. Cass exhaled through his nose. Stay behind me, he said. You do exactly what I tell you. You don't move, you don't speak, you don't make a decision without my signal. Agreed. I mean it. So do I, she said. Let's go. They moved along the fence line, low and fast, Cass in front with 2 of his men flanking. The gravel was wet. A rain had come through in the last hour, light but enough to make everything reflective and cold. And she focused on her footfall, keeping it soft, keeping the distance tight. The folder she held against her chest with both arms. The wind off the water was steady and sharp, and smelled like salt and rust and diesel. The service entrance was a personnel door set into the north wall, padlocked, but the lock had already been cut. Cass's work, she realized, from before he'd called her. He'd been moving on this location while she was still at the desk. He pushed the door open slow, inches at a time, and the hinges were mercifully silent, and then they were inside. The interior of the warehouse was vast and mostly dark. The portable work light they'd seen from outside positioned near the center of the ground floor, casting a circle of harsh white light surrounded by deep shadow. She let her eyes adjust. Stacked shipping containers along the east wall, old ones, doors hanging. A rusted conveyor system running the length of the space at about 20 feet overhead. Catwalks on both sides, maybe 30 feet up, running the perimeter. She saw Lucien before she saw anyone else. He was standing in the circle of light, not restrained, standing, his jacket on, his hands visible at his sides. But the 2 men flanking him, positioned 3 paces back on either side, were Rourke's. She could tell by the way they held themselves, the different set of readiness from Lucien's people, and by the fact that she'd never seen them before. Across from him, Damien Rourke. She'd had no image of him before this moment. She'd imagined someone physically imposing, the way powerful men in violent industries were often physically imposing, using mass as a kind of argument. Rourke was not that. He was medium height, medium build, the kind of man who disappeared in a crowd, with a face that was almost aggressively ordinary except for his eyes, which were very light and very steady in a way that had nothing ordinary about it. He was holding a phone. He looked at it, then at Lucien, then back at it. Your financial director's not answering, Rourke said. Conversational, like they were running through a checklist. Lucien said. That's a problem. Is it? It is, because Reyes was supposed to confirm your departure window 20 minutes ago, and if she's not answering, that means something in your house went sideways, and if something went sideways... Rourke looked up from the phone. Then whoever went sideways is now a variable I didn't plan for. Lucien said nothing. From the shadows near the east wall, movement. Serena tracked it before Cass did, a figure being brought forward from behind one of the container stacks, hands bound in front, walking under his own power but barely. The specific gait of someone running on something close to empty. Nolan. His face was swollen on the left side, not fresh, hours old maybe, and he was listing slightly to the right to favor the shoulder wound. He looked up and across the space, and she saw the moment he found Lucien, and his face did something complicated that she couldn't read from 40 feet away in bad light. He hadn't found her yet. She was still in the dark. Here's what I'm proposing, Rourke said. He tucked the phone away. You walk out of here with your people. The girl's brother goes with me. I authenticate what he has, I make certain determinations about how to use it, and you and I both get a clean horizon. No war. No collateral damage to operations that are, frankly, functioning better than either of us would like to admit they are. And the evidence? Lucian said. The evidence serves both our interests if it's managed correctly. You mean buried? Rourke tilted his head. I mean managed. You'd let Hale walk, Lucian said, and Voss. I'd let them be useful, Rourke said. There's a difference. A man you have something on is a different kind of asset than a man you've destroyed. You know that. Lucian looked at him. You've been planning this longer than I knew, he said. Not accusatory, almost thoughtful. 4 years, Rourke said. Give or take. Costa. Costa was functional until recently. Something shifted in Rourke's expression. I'm curious how you found out about Reyes. I'm curious too, Lucian said, and Serena understood from the specific flatness of how he said it that he hadn't known about Reyes until this moment, that Rourke had just told him, that Rourke had meant to destabilize him with it and had miscalculated because Lucian didn't destabilize the way other men did. He absorbed and recalculated and kept his face exactly the same. She pressed herself further back against the wall. Cass's hand appeared at her elbow, not grabbing, just present. Then Nolan spoke. I'll go, he said. The room shifted. Lucien turned his head slightly. Rourke turned fully to look at Nolan. She saw her brother's face, pale, swollen, holding something behind the eyes that she recognized as the specific expression of a man who has made a decision he can't take back and is either at peace with it or pretending to be so well that the difference doesn't matter. Nolan, Lucian said, low. He can have me, Nolan said. He looked at Rourke. But you don't need him. The documents, the authentication, I can give you that without DeMarco in the room. You don't need his permission for anything you're planning. He straightened as much as his shoulder allowed. Let his people go, all of them. Anyone you're holding, and I'll verify whatever you need verified. You're not in a position to negotiate, Rourke said. I'm the only person in this room who actually knows where the originals are, Nolan said. So that's not quite accurate. Rourke studied him. The portable work light threw everything in sharp relief. The planes of faces, the angles of bodies, the rivulets of water still working their way down the corrugated walls from the rain. The originals aren't in the documents you copied, Rourke said. No, Nolan said. Where are they? Let them go first. A pause. Rourke looked at Lucien, then back at Nolan. He was running the calculation. She could see it even from 40 feet away in bad light, the slight movement of his eyes that meant a man was weighing options against each other. Then one of Rourke's men on the catwalk above called down. One word, low and clipped. She didn't catch it. Rourke caught it. His expression changed. He looked at the shadows along the north wall, at exactly the place where Serena was standing. Bring her out, he said. Cass's hand tightened on her elbow. She made the decision in less than a second. Not a calculated one, an instinctive one, the kind that came from 6 days of learning what this world moved like and what stopped it, and stepped forward into the light herself before anyone could bring her. The logic was simple. Being brought out by someone meant being under control. Walking out meant something else. She walked. She heard Cass say something very quietly behind her that she chose not to process. She walked into the circle of light and stopped 6 feet from Lucian. She didn't look at him. She looked at Rourke. You wanted to know about the variable, she said. I'm the variable. Rourke looked at her with those light, steady eyes. Serena Vale, he said. That's right. He looked at the folder in her arms. What's in that? 4 years of payment records linking you, Hale, Voss, and Reyes in a coordinated conspiracy against 3 organized crime networks and a federal investigation. She held it against her chest. I built the chart tonight, from Lucien's archives and from a routing sequence your people missed on page 9 of the folder Reyes put together. She paused. You should have had her strip the metadata. Something moved in Rourke's face. Not fear, This was a man who'd operated too long in too much danger to register fear on his face, but the specific quality of a person encountering a problem they hadn't priced in. "That folder doesn't leave this building," he said. "The folder doesn't need to leave," she said. "I've already transmitted the core structure to 3 separate parties outside this building." She hadn't. She had no phone, no way to transmit anything, and the claim was a flat lie told in a voice she'd spent 20 minutes in the car rehearsing without knowing she was rehearsing it. But Rourke didn't know that. And the thing about financial evidence, unlike physical evidence, unlike testimony, was that the threat of its existence was almost as powerful as its actual existence. Because financial evidence didn't need to be in one place. It could be copied, fragmented, distributed. And anyone in Rourke's position who understood money understood that the worst thing about a financial record wasn't that it existed. It was that you could never be entirely certain you'd found all of it. Rourke was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Shoot her." Lucian moved. She'd seen him move fast before, crossing the study in 2 strides, the controlled urgency of a man who'd made a physical decision before his face caught up with it. But she hadn't seen him move like this. He was between her and Rourke's man before the man's weapon was fully raised, and the collision was brutal and immediate, both of them going into the stack of equipment crates on the east side with a crash that echoed off the metal walls. Everything happened simultaneously. Cass and his 2 men came out of the north wall shadows, weapons up, and the 2 men who'd been flanking Lucien spun, and the space went from controlled standoff to open chaos in under 2 seconds. She heard the pop of a gun. Suppressed, she thought, the sound wrong and flat. And something hit the concrete 4 feet to her left, and she was already moving, not toward the door, toward Nolan. He was still standing near the container stack. The man who'd brought him out had moved toward the fight, and for a window of maybe 3 seconds, Nolan was unwatched. She covered the distance without thinking about it, grabbed his bound wrists, and pulled him behind the nearest container. "Original evidence," she said, breathing hard. "Where?" "Sari, where, Nolan? Right now." He looked at her in the dark behind the container with water leaking down the metal beside his head, and his face swollen and his shoulder wrapped, and his eyes doing the thing they'd been doing since he walked into that room, the specific look of a man who's been sitting with a secret for long enough that it's become part of his skeleton. "Storage unit," he said. "Off Route 9, Unit 44. The lock code is Dad's birthday." She absorbed that. Their father's birthday, November 3rd. "The complete originals," she said. "Everything. Physical copies. A drive with digital backups and—" He stopped. "And what?" "An affidavit," he said, from someone who was inside Hale's operation from the beginning, someone who helped build it." His jaw moved. "Someone who came to me 6 months ago because they were done." She stared at him. "Who?" A crash from the main floor, something large hitting the concrete, the conveyor system above shaking with impact vibration. She pressed herself against the container. "Who, Nolan?" "Reyes," he said. The word landed wrong. She heard it, processed it, and then processed it again. "Reyes," she said. "She built the payment architecture," he said, 14 years ago, for Hale. And she's been trying to get out for 4 years, and every time she got close, he stopped. "She came to me because I was the only person looking at the right documents. She told me everything. She pointed me to where the physical originals were being stored. She's why I was able to take them." The ground moved under her understanding of the last 6 hours. Not metaphorically. She felt it, a physical shift. The sensation of a structure she'd built very carefully in the last 3 hours, rearranging itself around a fact she'd had completely wrong. Reyes hadn't been managing Lucian's attention. She'd put the folder together for him because she wanted the routing sequence found. She'd surfaced the evidence because she was trying to hand it over. The phone call Cass had blocked. Not to a contact outside. Away from one. "She's not working for Rourke," Serena said. "She never was," Nolan said. "She was working to get out. And if Rourke finds out she's the reason this whole operation is exposed, he'll kill her," Serena said. She moved. Cass caught her arm as she came around the container, and she pulled against it hard enough that he tightened his grip to keep hold of her. And she said, "Reyes, where is she right now? Exactly." Contained, I told you. She's not the enemy, Serena said. She's a witness. She has an affidavit in Nolan's storage unit, and if Rourke has anyone left in that house... Cass's face changed. He spoke into his radio. Fast, clipped, a location and an instruction. He listened. His jaw went tight. She's already been moved, he said. Someone got to her 20 minutes ago. One of the men I had on her is down. The warehouse around them was still loud. Intermittent, irregular sound, the fight on the main floor unresolved but evolving. And she registered all of it as background while the foreground rearranged itself again. Rourke had known about Reyes. That was what the phone exchange with Lucien had been. Not a negotiation tactic, an information check. He'd been confirming whether Reyes had been neutralized. When she stopped answering, he'd read it right. Not that something in Lucien's house had gone sideways by accident, but that Reyes had flipped, that she'd been giving Lucien's people what they needed. He'd sent someone for her before he'd even started talking. "Is she alive?" she said. "We don't know." She turned. Through the gap between containers, she could see the main floor, could see Lucien, still moving, which was the only thing that mattered, trading positions with two of Rourke's men near the center of the space. Cass's people had the north end. Rourke was nowhere she could see, which meant he'd moved, which meant movement on the catwalk, above and to the right. She looked up. Rourke was up there. He'd gone up while everyone was on the ground floor, and he was moving along the catwalk with two men, toward the east end, toward the stairwell that connected back to the ground level, and toward the service door. The exit. He was leaving. She looked at the folder in her arms. She looked at the catwalk. She looked at the stairwell door at the far end of the east wall, which she could reach before Rourke got down from the catwalk, if she moved now, if she cut across the south edge of the floor while the fight on the north end held everyone's attention. "Don't," Cass said. She was already moving. The south edge of the floor was darker than the center. She went low and fast, the folder clutched to her chest, the concrete wet and uneven under her feet, and she covered the distance to the east stairwell door in under 15 seconds. She heard Cass behind her, heard him making a different calculation, cover her or stay with the fight. And she didn't look back. She went through the stairwell door. Inside was pure dark. She pressed against the wall and listened. Above her, footsteps on metal stairs descending, 2 sets, no, 3, Rourke and 2 men. And she calculated the distance and the rate and pushed herself flat into the corner behind the door. The first man through the door went straight through into the warehouse floor without pausing. The second man, same. Rourke came last. She didn't have a weapon. She had a folder of financial documents and the specific advantage of knowing where he was going before he'd completed the step. She stepped out of the corner and put the folder directly in front of his face and said, "Stop." He stopped. The surprise was genuine. She saw it, a half-second of pure physical startlement before the control came back. And in that half-second, she said what she needed to say, fast and flat, and without inflection, because inflection would undermine it. "The storage unit off Route 9 is already flagged," she said. "Everything in it goes to a federal contact the moment Lucien DeMarco doesn't make a check-in call, which he's going to make from this building in approximately 10 minutes, or everything in that unit is in the hands of a prosecutor who has nothing to lose. You can't stop the transmission. You can't get to the unit in time. You can't reach Reyes because she already made the call 2 hours ago." All of it fabricated, all of it delivered in the voice of a woman who'd spent 20 years learning to present financial reconstructions to people who desperately didn't want the news she was bringing. "What you can do is stop right here." Rourke looked at her. The 2 men he'd come through with had turned. She was aware of them behind her without looking. "You're bluffing," he said. "I might be," she said. "But you built this operation on a financial foundation, which means you understand risk calculation. And the risk you're looking at right now is total exposure versus an exit that costs you certain assets but keeps you operational." She held his gaze. "Which risk would you prefer?" He looked at the folder. He looked at her face. And she heard from the main floor behind the door Lucien's voice, not shouting, the controlled drop that was more authoritative than any shout, saying something she couldn't fully make out but that had the quality of a situation ending rather than continuing. Rourke heard it too. He reached inside his jacket, her whole body tensed. He saw it and almost smiled, the first expression she'd seen on him that looked like an actual emotion. And he took out his phone. He looked at it. He looked at her. "The storage unit," he said. "Route 9, Unit 44. You have it under control. Every document, everything Nolan copied, everything Reyes kept, and a full chart of the payment architecture going back 14 years with named endpoints and source transactions." She didn't let her eyes move from his. "It's over." He was quiet for a long moment. Behind her, the door, the sounds of the warehouse floor going to a different kind of silence. Then the stairwell door opened. Lucien. He took in the scene in one look. Serena, Rourke, the two men behind her, the folder in her hands, and she saw his face do the specific thing it had done when she'd shown him the payment chart for the first time. The surprise that cost him something to show. Rourke looked at Lucien. "Your woman," he said, "is the most dangerous person in this building." Lucien looked at Serena. She looked back at him with her heart going at twice its normal rate and her hands steady around the folder because she'd discovered tonight that her hands were reliable even when the rest of her wasn't. "The unit," she said to Lucien. "Route 9. We need to move." His eyes held hers for exactly one beat longer than necessary. Then he looked at Rourke, and his voice went flat and certain and final as he said, "You're going to sit down now." Rourke sat, and Serena Vale stood in a wet stairwell in an abandoned waterfront warehouse at 5 in the morning with financial evidence pressed against her chest and her brother somewhere behind her, and the man she'd spent 6 days learning to read standing in front of her, and she understood, quietly, without drama, in the way the truest things arrived, that whatever happened next was not going to be like anything that had come before it, because she was not the same person who'd been brought into that house with a hood over her head. That person had been waiting for the disaster to end. This one was standing in the middle of it, and she had not run, and her hands were still steady, and there was exactly one thing left to do before this night was over. She looked at Lucien and said, "We need to get to Reyes first." He nodded once. They moved. They found Reyes in a maintenance shed 40 yards from the warehouse's eastern perimeter wall, zip-tied to a support post with a gash along her hairline that had bled down the side of her face and dried there in a dark stripe. She was conscious. That was the first thing. Serena registered it before anything else. The woman's eyes opened, tracking them as they came through the door. The specific quality of alertness in someone who has decided that staying conscious is an act of will rather than a passive state. One of Cass's men cut her loose. She didn't make a sound when her arms came forward. She pressed her wrists together in her lap. The same instinct Serena had had, that first night in the chair, and something in that parallel sat quietly between them without being said. Lucien crouched in front of her. "Reyes," he said. She looked at him. Her face was doing something complicated. Not guilt exactly, not relief exactly. The specific expression of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down and isn't sure their body remembers how. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Tonight," he said. "An hour ago." She nodded slowly. "I tried to tell you 3 times," she said. "Over 4 years. I got as far as picking up the phone twice." She looked at her hands. "The first time was when I found out what Hale had done to the Vale account. The second time was when Costa embedded." "You brought Costa in," Lucien said. "Yes." The word was flat and final, and she didn't try to soften it. "Hale told me it was either Costa or my son. He was 11 years old." She looked up. "I chose wrong. I know I chose wrong. I've known that every day since." Lucien was quiet for a moment. She couldn't see his face from where she stood, only his profile. The jaw, the line of his shoulder, the hand resting on his knee. "The affidavit," he said. "Complete," Reyes said. 14 years. Every transaction I built, every contact I made on Hale's behalf, every instruction I received from Voss." She met his eyes. "I kept records. Parallel records, separate from the operational accounts, stored with Nolan's materials because he was the only person who had the right to them." Her gaze moved past Lucien to Serena. "Your father didn't know what he was signing," she said. "I need you to know that." The consulting contract, it was structured to look like legitimate work. He was brought in by someone he trusted, and he had no visibility into what the entity actually was. She paused. When he started asking questions, Hale moved to dissolve the connection. By then, it was too late. Serena stood in the doorway of the maintenance shed with the cold coming off the water and the first gray edge of dawn pressing at the sky behind the warehouse, and held the folder against her chest and said, "What happened to him was deliberate." "Yes," Reyes said. "Hale destroyed him deliberately." Hale destroyed him because he became a liability who was asking the right questions. Reyes said it plainly. The plainness was its own kind of respect. He would have found it eventually. He was already close. Hale accelerated the collapse before he could. She held Serena's gaze. "Your father was not a foolish man. He was a careful man who trusted the wrong person, who handed him to the wrong structure. The difference matters." Serena breathed. The shed smelled like rust and water and machine oil. The folder in her arms was heavy in the way that things were heavy when they meant something beyond their physical weight. She looked at Reyes and nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness. She didn't have the space for that yet and wouldn't pretend to, but it was acknowledgement, which was what the moment called for. Lucien stood. He looked at Cass. "Get her somewhere clean and get a doctor on the cut," he said. "Nobody moves anything from this location until I say." Cass nodded. Lucien turned. He looked at Serena. The look was brief and specific, and said more than any of the controlled conversations they'd had in the study, in the kitchen, in the hallway outside rooms full of dangerous men. Then he moved past her toward the warehouse. She followed. The next 4 hours were operational and exhausting, and she was present for most of them. The storage unit off Route 9 was reached by 2 of Lucien's men and confirmed intact, the lock code her father's birthday, November 3, the combination working on the first try in a way that made her close her eyes for 3 seconds before she moved on. The materials inside were transferred under Cass's supervision. Physical documents, 340 pages, a drive, and Reyes's parallel ledger, handwritten in a spiral notebook that looked so ordinary she might have passed it in a drugstore without a second glance, until you opened it and saw 14 years of crimes indexed in a financial director's precise handwriting. Nolan went with the team. His shoulder needed proper attention, and he was operating on the far side of whatever had been keeping him vertical since they'd found him in the warehouse, and she watched him climb into the car with the specific movement of a man whose body was finally collecting what it was owed. He looked back at her once before the door closed. She held the look for a moment. She'd deal with him. Not tonight, not in the next 72 hours, but eventually, in a room where it was just the 2 of them, and no one else needed anything from either of them. They'd been through enough together, over enough years, and enough disasters, that she knew how those conversations went. How they started with anger and moved into grief and ended somewhere neither of them expected, which was usually somewhere close to the truth. She knew they'd get there. She just wasn't there yet. Baimon. The federal contact Lucien had called Chen turned out to be a woman. Mid-50s, steel gray hair pulled back, moving through the pre-dawn with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd been woken at odd hours for serious things for long enough that the urgency had become a kind of resting state. She arrived at the waterfront location at 7:15 with 2 other people and looked at the materials for 40 minutes without speaking. Then she spoke with Lucien for 20 minutes alone in the far end of the warehouse, while Serena sat on an overturned equipment crate and drank coffee from a thermos someone had produced from somewhere and stared at the corrugated wall. She wasn't tired. She was past tired, in the territory beyond it, where the body had abandoned its normal signaling systems and was simply continuing because the alternatives were unacceptable. Her hands were steady. She noted that again, the way she'd been noting it all night. It seemed important to know about yourself. Chen came over to her when she was done with Lucien. She looked at the folder in Serena's hands. "You built the chart," she said. "Yes." "From Lucien DeMarco's financial archives. And from a routing sequence in the folder Reyes assembled, and from materials in the storage unit." Serena looked at her evenly. "If you need it explained to someone, I can do that. I've spent most of my adult life explaining financial reconstructions to people who didn't want to hear them." Chen almost smiled. I'll be in touch, she said. She left. Lucian came and sat beside her on the equipment crate. Not beside her exactly. One crate over, the distance between them the width of a deliberate choice. He set his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. Rourke, she said. Being held. He didn't elaborate. She didn't ask. Hale. Chen's problem now, he said, and Voss. The documentation is solid enough that they're not going anywhere useful. He was quiet for a moment. The two names on the task force contact list. The second account. Endpoint B, she said. It was Reyes's account, he said. Her personal one, separate from the operational channels she built. She'd been moving funds out of the structure for 4 years into a holding account, not keeping them. He looked at the floor. Moving them into a trust. For families of people Hale's operation had damaged. He paused. Including yours. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, that's why the compression. She was reducing her own visible take as she routed more into the trust. Not getting out. Getting people out from under the damage. Yes. And we thought she was managing exposure, he said. We were wrong. She turned that over. Reyes at a desk in this house for 4 years, building the visible architecture of loyalty while quietly trying to undo some fraction of what she'd helped cause. Not redemption. She hadn't said the word, and neither would Serena, but something that lived in the same territory. The particular kind of action that didn't ask to be called anything, that just tried to reduce the weight of what it had caused. The trust, Serena said. What happens to it? Chen will freeze it pending review, Lucy said. After that, he exhaled. I'm going to ask that it be released to the designated accounts. He didn't look at her when he said it. Including yours. She turned and looked at his profile. You don't need to do that. I know. I didn't help you for... I know that too, he said. He looked at her. You helped me because it was the only way to get your brother back and get to the truth of what happened to your father. I know what the motivation was. His eyes held hers. I'm not compensating you. I'm trying to correct a structural damage that ran through this operation and through your family at the same time. A pause. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. You've been thinking about that distinction for a while, she said. Since about 3 a.m, he said. The warehouse around them was quieter now. Most of the people had moved out or through. The portable work light was still on in the center of the floor, throwing that same harsh circle, looking smaller now in the growing gray light coming through the high windows. What happens to your operation? She said. He was quiet for a beat. Some of it ends, he said. The parts that were functional because of the agreements Hale and Voss had managed. Those go away. The structure underneath, the parts that were actually mine. He paused. I've been thinking about that for longer than 3 a.m. And? He looked at the light in the center of the floor. There are things I built that work without the criminal foundation, he said. Property, logistics, 3 companies that actually do what they say they do. I've been running them as covers for a long time. He looked at his hands. Cover stops being necessary when the thing you're covering changes. She didn't say anything. She let him have the space to finish the thought. I'm not reformed, he said flatly. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to tell you tonight made me into something I wasn't before. That's not how it works, and I don't believe in that version. He turned to look at her. What I'm saying is that the reasons I kept certain things running were connected to agreements that no longer exist, and without those agreements, the cost-to-value calculation changes. That's the most unsentimental description of a life change I've ever heard, she said. Would you prefer a sentimental one? No, she said. Good, he said. Because I don't have one. They sat in the quiet of the warehouse while the dawn came up outside and the portable work light became gradually irrelevant against the growing day. 3 days later, Serena sat across from Nolan in the kitchen of a property Lucian had arranged. Not the main house, a smaller one, on the north side of the city, quiet street. And they had the conversation she'd known was coming. It lasted 2 hours. He told her everything from the beginning. The job with Hale, which he'd taken not by accident but by design. He'd found the thread years ago, working backward from the bankruptcy with the obsessive patience of a man who had nothing else to hold on to, until he found a name, and then another, and then a way in. 14 months undercover in Hale's operation, copying what he could, building toward the moment he'd take what he needed and surface it. He told her about finding Reyes, about sitting across from her in a rented room with a table between them and her setting down a notebook and saying, "I've been waiting for someone to come looking." He told her about giving copies to Rourke, which had been the mistake, the single catastrophic miscalculation in an otherwise careful plan. He'd met Rourke through a contact he'd trusted, a journalist who'd turned out to be more afraid of the story than he'd claimed. Rourke had presented himself as a man with resources and motivation. He'd been half right. He told her about leaving Serena as collateral. He said it directly, without preamble, without building to it. "I left you," he said. "I knew what DeMarco would do, and I left anyway because I thought I'd be back before it got this far. And I was wrong, and I had no right to make that calculation for you." She looked at him across the table. He looked like himself again. The shoulder healing, the swelling mostly gone, some of the hollow quality behind his eyes filled in with something that wasn't peace, but was at least not the thing it had been. "You were right that Dad didn't do anything wrong," she said. "Yes." "You could have told me," she said, "years ago, when you first found the thread." "I know. I would have helped you. I know that too." He looked at his hands on the table. "That's why I didn't tell you, because I didn't want you in this. And then you ended up in it anyway, which—" He stopped. "Which tells you something about the plan," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It does." She poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of him. She held hers and looked out the window at the street. Ordinary, quiet, morning traffic, people who didn't know anything about what had happened 3 nights ago in a waterfront warehouse. "I'm angry at you," she said. "I know. I'm going to be angry at you for a while." "Okay. And then eventually I won't be," she said. "That's how it works with us. I need you to know that's not permission to do this again." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, settled. "It's done," he said. "There's nothing left to do it for. It's over." She nodded. She drank her coffee. She let the morning be ordinary for a little while. The arrest came in 2 waves. Hale first, on a Tuesday, the news moving across every screen in the city by noon with the specific velocity of a story that had been held back and then released all at once. Voss 2 days later, along with 3 members of the federal task force, 2 city officials, and a state-level appointment that sent the political conversation into a spiral that would take months to resolve. Serena watched none of it in real time. She learned about Hale from Cass, who texted a single word: "Done." She learned about Voss from a news alert on a phone she'd finally retrieved from whoever had been holding it, sitting in the kitchen with coffee, and she read the article once and put the phone down and didn't pick it up again for an hour. She thought about her father, not with the grief she'd carried for 6 years, which had been built on a false foundation. The grief of a man who had failed, who had made bad decisions, whose collapse had been his own. She was building a different relationship with the loss now. It would take time, she knew that. The architecture of grief didn't dismantle easily just because you discovered it was constructed on wrong information. You had to go back through it piece by piece, reinterpret each room. But she'd done structural reconstruction before. She knew how it worked. She saw Lucien for the first time after the arrests on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the waterfront. He came to the North Side property. Not unannounced, he'd called ahead, which she noted, and she met him at the door. He looked different in daylight, or maybe not different. Maybe she'd just been seeing him in crisis light for so long that ordinary light was the difference. He was wearing a jacket she hadn't seen before. He looked like someone who had slept, which was its own kind of change. "Walk?" he said. They walked. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet that accumulated in areas of the city that had been through several identities and hadn't settled on the latest one yet. Old houses, some of them restored, some still in the process. A pocket park at the end of the block with 2 benches and a tree that had grown into the sidewalk in a way the concrete had tried to resist and failed. They sat on one of the benches. "Reyes," she said. "Cooperating witness," he said. Chen's case. The trust is released. It'll take another month for the accounts to clear, but it's moving. He paused. She's relocating. She asked me to tell you she's sorry she didn't find a better way. Serena looked at the tree growing through the concrete. Tell her I said she found a way, she said. That's enough. He was quiet for a moment. Rourke will plead, he said. Chen says the evidence is sufficient that he doesn't have room to do anything else. He paused. He'll be inside for a long time. She nodded. She wasn't thinking about Rourke. The operation, she said, transitioning. He set his elbows on his knees in the way she'd come to recognize as his thinking posture, slightly forward, hands loose, looking at the middle distance. The 3 legitimate companies are already structured for expansion. I brought in an outside director for 2 of them last week. He paused. I'm offering Cass a formal role. He'll take it, she said. I know. She looked at her hands. And you? And me, he said. I'm working on the answer to that. That's honest. I try, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the tree, at the place where the roots had pushed the concrete up in a long, slow argument that the concrete had clearly been losing for years. There was something in the set of his face that she'd been learning to read for weeks. The controlled surface and what moved underneath it. And what she saw now was quieter than anything she'd seen on him before. Not peace, not happiness. Something more like the expression of a man standing in unfamiliar terrain and deciding he can learn it. The house, she said. What about it? I've been thinking about the financial records, she said. Not the criminal ones, the operational structure underneath, the companies you have. She paused. They're not well organized from an accounting standpoint. The way they're set up, there's significant exposure that has nothing to do with criminal liability, just structural inefficiency. Tax positioning issues, holding arrangements that haven't been updated in years. He looked at her. I'm not offering out of obligation, she said. I'm offering because it's what I'm good at, and because the work is genuinely interesting, and because... She stopped and let the third reason sit unspoken. Because it was too early for the third reason, and she'd learned enough in the last 3 weeks about what happened when you move too fast in uncertain territory. He held her gaze. The third reason, he said. Later, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, she still hadn't seen a complete one, but close. I'll have Cass send you the holding structure documents, he said. I'll need 3 years of returns, she said. You'll have them. She nodded. She looked back at the tree. The light was doing something specific in the late afternoon. The angle of it through the branches throwing patterns on the concrete that shifted when the wind moved through. She sat with it for a while. She let the afternoon be what it was. My father would have liked knowing it ended this way, she said. Not to Lucien specifically. To the air, to the afternoon, to whatever version of him still occupied the space her grief had been keeping. He wasn't a dramatic man. He would have wanted it to end in documents and correct accounting and the right names on the right lines. She exhaled. He got that at least. Eventually. Lucien was quiet. He didn't offer anything to fill the silence, which was one of the things she'd noticed about him from the beginning, that he understood the difference between a silence that needed filling and one that needed company. He sat beside her and let her have the moment without trying to improve it. After a while, she said, "We should go back." "In a minute," he said. She looked at him. He was still looking at the tree. His hands were loosely linked between his knees. He looked, for the first time in her experience of him, like a man who was not managing anything, who was just sitting somewhere in the afternoon without calculating what it cost. She let the minute pass. Then another. The light shifted. A car went by on the cross street. Someone down the block was cutting grass, the sound of it small and domestic and completely ordinary. 3 weeks ago, Lucien said, I was going to execute you. I know, she said. I want you to know that I know what that means, he said. What it means that I didn't, and what it means that I'm sitting here now. He turned and looked at her directly. I'm not telling you that as an appeal for something. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to hear that I understand the weight of it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, You didn't execute me because you saw me stand between your men and a 9-year-old kid on a gravel driveway. Yes. That's a thin reason, she said. It is, he said, and it was enough. He looked at her steadily. The thinnest reasons are usually the ones that tell you the most. She thought about that. She thought about the chain of thin reasons that had brought her from a chair with zip-tied wrists in a cold room to a bench in the afternoon with a man who had, in the space of 3 weeks, become the most legible person in her immediate world. The way legibility happened, not all at once, not through any single revelation, but through accumulation, through the pattern of small behaviors over time. She was good at patterns. She'd built her whole professional life on them. I'm going to need an office, she said. I'll arrange it. With a door that closes, obviously. And access to the full records from the beginning, not the sanitized versions. He almost smiled again. You already said that. I'm establishing it as a consistent position, she said. Noted, he said. She stood. He stood with her. They walked back toward the property in the afternoon light, their footsteps unhurried on the sidewalk, the city going about its ordinary business around them. She didn't reach for his hand and he didn't reach for hers, but there was something in the space between them as they walked. The particular proximity of two people who have been through enough together that their bodies have adjusted to each other's presence and don't feel the need to announce it. Later, there would be depositions. Months of them, her sitting across tables from federal attorneys and reconstructing the payment architecture in language that non-financial people could follow, which was harder than building the chart in the first place. Later, there would be the structural work on Lucien's companies, 3 months of it, the kind of detailed, unglamorous work she was genuinely good at, sitting in an office with a closed door going through records that hadn't been properly organized since the companies were founded and slowly making order out of them. Later, Nolan would finish his own formal cooperation process and move to a different city and call her on a Sunday evening from wherever he'd landed, his voice carrying the specific quality of a man who was trying on ordinary life and finding it stranger and more demanding than anything he'd prepared for. She would talk to him for an hour. She would do that most Sundays. Later, Reyes would send a letter, actual paper, actual envelope, from wherever she'd relocated, addressed to Serena in handwriting that was exactly as precise as her ledgers. It would say very little. It would say the one thing it needed to say, that she hoped the account had arrived, and that she was sorry it had taken so long to find the right person to give it to. Serena would read it twice and file it in the folder she was keeping now, the one with all the documents from that week, the chart she'd drawn in 3 colors, the page with the circled name and the 3 question marks that she'd never erased. She kept the folder. Not as evidence, as record. As the precise account of the week she'd stopped cleaning up after disasters and started walking toward them with her hands steady and her eyes open, which was the closest thing to power she'd ever found. Not the kind that silenced neighborhoods or moved money through invisible channels, but the kind that lived in knowing what the numbers actually said and having the nerve to say it out loud. They reached the property. Lucien held the door. She went inside. The afternoon light came through the windows and fell across the kitchen table in long rectangles, the way light did in the late part of a day that had been ordinary and would continue to be ordinary. And Serena Vale stood in it for a moment, just stood in it, the folder on the table, the coffee from that morning still on the counter in a cup she hadn't finished, and felt the particular quiet weight of a life that had been remade not by luck or rescue, but by her own specific refusal to stay in any chair she hadn't chosen. It wasn't a triumphant feeling. It was smaller than that, and more solid, and it was hers. She picked up the unfinished coffee. She drank it cold. She sat down and got to work.